The last time you tapped a tip at a coffee counter, you did not choose a number. A machine offered you three options. The middle one was already highlighted, and a screen was angled so the person behind the counter could see exactly what you picked. You felt the social pressure before your brain finished processing the transaction. That moment was not accidental. It was engineered. Phenomenon. You have been standing at a counter, card already tapped, and a screen pivots toward you with three numbers glowing on it. You have maybe 4 seconds. There is a line behind you. The barista is watching. One of those numbers is already ringed in a border that signals it as the expected choice, and you feel, not think, feel, that choosing the lower option requires a justification you do not have time to construct. This experience happens dozens of times a week across coffee shops, ride shares, restaurant tablets, grocery self-checkouts, and food delivery apps. The specific numbers change. The architecture does not. There is always a default. There is always a social context. And there is almost always a time constraint that prevents deliberation. Most people assume they are making a free choice at that screen. They are selecting from a menu someone else designed, under conditions someone else engineered, within a time window someone else compressed. The choice feels personal. The architecture was not. Understanding the gap between those two things is what this video is about, and once you see it, you will see it everywhere. Mechanism. You are already tilted before you touch the screen. The default option on a choice interface does not merely suggest a preference, it redefines what normal looks like, and your brain uses that new normal as its baseline for every option around it. The foundational research here comes from economists William Samuelson and Richard Zeckhauser, who in 1988 documented what they called the status quo bias, the consistent, measurable tendency for people to stick with whatever option is presented as the current or default state, even when switching would serve their interests better. Their work established that the default is not a neutral starting point. It is a gravitational field. Richard Thaler and Sunstein built on this directly in their 2008 book Nudge, arguing that choice architects, anyone who designs the environment in which people make decisions, hold enormous power precisely because defaults are sticky. Doing nothing in a default-rich environment is not inaction, it is compliance with whoever set the default. The tip screen is a small, everyday instance of this, but Madrian and Shea demonstrated in a landmark 2001 study in the Quarterly Journal of Economics that the same mechanism governs whether employees enroll in retirement savings plans. When enrollment was opt-out rather than opt-in, participation rates jumped dramatically, not because people's preferences changed, but because the default did. The architecture made the choice before the person showed up. Your decision-making is not degraded at the tip screen because you are careless. It is degraded because the system was designed around your cognitive limits. A 2026 paper in the Journal of Behavioral Decision-Making by Derfanian and colleagues tested the interaction between cognitive load and default nudges in real purchasing decisions. Their finding was precise. As cognitive load increases, people's tendency to accept the default option increases significantly. The tip screen is a masterclass in applied cognitive load. You have just completed a transaction. You are holding a card or a phone. There may be background noise. There is time pressure. There is a social audience. Every one of those conditions is a load on the same mental system that would otherwise evaluate the options carefully. Thaler and Sunstein call this System 1 thinking, fast, automatic, pattern matching. The default survives not because it is the best option, but because rejecting it requires System 2, slow, deliberate, effortful reasoning. The design of the point-of-sale screen is a System 1 environment. Every element, the time pressure, the social visibility, the pre-highlighted button, is engineered to ensure that System 2 never fully activates. Muncher and colleagues, in a 2015 review of choice architecture techniques published in the Journal of Behavioral Decision-Making, found that defaults are among the most powerful tools available, precisely because they operate below the threshold of conscious deliberation. They do not persuade, they simply preempt. The third mechanism is the one that changes the money in your pocket most directly. The three options on a tip screen are not designed to represent a fair range of choices. They are designed to anchor your perception of what constitutes a reasonable tip. When a screen shows you 18%, 20%, and 25% as the three options, it has already accomplished something before you press anything. It has defined the floor. 18% is no longer a generous tip. It is the smallest option, the one that implies you are choosing the minimum. The architecture makes generosity invisible and makes the lowest offered option feel like the stingy choice. Mounier and colleagues, in a 2024 paper in the Journal of Behavioral Decision-Making, examined how framing of the default option shapes perception of all surrounding choices, finding that the label and position of the default does not merely indicate preference, it actively reframes the entire evaluative context. What feels like a free numerical choice is actually a perception built inside a frame someone else constructed. Thaler and Sunstein identified this as a core property of choice architecture. The options you never see shape your response to the ones you do. A tip screen that offered 5%, 10%, and 15% would produce systematically different behavior. Not because customers became less generous, but because the anchor moved. The numbers are not describing reality, they are constructing it. If you want to stop being the person this works on, hit subscribe. We decode a new manipulation system every week, and knowing it is the only defense that actually holds. Let us keep going. Trap. The tip screen is where you first notice this mechanism, because the social pressure is immediate and visible. But the same architecture runs silently through almost every commercial interaction you have. And in most of them, there is no cashier watching. There is just a default that your cognitive load accepted on your behalf. When you sign up for a streaming service, the annual plan is typically pre-selected. When you complete an online checkout, the box for email marketing is pre-checked. When you buy insurance on a flight, the coverage is bundled in by default and requires active removal. Amazon Subscribe and Save automatically renews on a preset schedule. Microsoft 365 renews annually unless you locate the cancellation path through 4 menu layers. Every one of these is a deliberate application of the same principle Samuelson and Zeckhauser documented in 1988. The status quo is sticky, and the architecture exploits that stickiness commercially. The tip screen has one feature that most other default traps do not: a witness. The physical design of the point-of-sale tablet, the screen angled toward the cashier, the transaction visible to the person behind the counter, activates a mechanism that operates independently of the default itself. This is not anchoring. This is social conformity under observation, and it does not require any particular option to be pre-highlighted. The mere visibility of your choice to another person changes the distribution of choices people make. Thaler and Sunstein address this directly in Nudge. Social defaults, what other people appear to do, are among the most powerful defaults of all, precisely because human beings are intensely sensitive to norms and to the perception of being judged against them. The cashier-facing screen makes your tip choice a social performance. The middle option is not just the anchored option. It is the option that requires no explanation to an observer. This design is not accidental. The behavioral science behind it is well documented in the choice architecture literature. Muncher and colleagues' 2015 taxonomy identifies social norm defaults as distinct from pure inertia defaults. They function through a different mechanism, shame and conformity, rather than laziness, but they produce the same outcome: acceptance of the architected choice. The screen facing the cashier is the point where two separate mechanisms, the default anchor and the social norm, converge on the same button. Defense. Knowing the mechanism is the first defense. The deliberate pause is the second. The entire architecture of the point-of-sale default depends on one thing: that you accept the cognitive environment as given. The time pressure, the social visibility, the pre-highlighted option. These are conditions you can name now. Naming them is not a small thing. Research in behavioral economics consistently shows that awareness of a nudge reduces its effect, not eliminates it, but measurably reduces it. The Irfanian et al. 2026 study found that when subjects were briefed on the existence of default nudges before a task, their adherence to defaults dropped significantly compared to unbriefed subjects. Here is the audit framework. Before you accept any default in a commercial context, run 3 questions in sequence. 1. Who set this default, and what do they gain if I accept it? 2. Is this the option I would have chosen if I had constructed the menu myself? 3. What would I choose if no one was watching? At a tip screen specifically, decide your tip policy before you approach the counter. A predetermined number removes the anchor entirely. You are no longer choosing inside their frame. You are arriving with your own. The choice architecture is not going away. It is a rational business strategy, and Thaler and Sunstein acknowledge that defaults can serve legitimate purposes when set in the interest of the chooser. The question is always, whose interest is this default serving? Asking that question out loud is the act that restores the choice to you. The tip screen is a small theater of behavioral economics. But the principles it embodies, status quo bias, cognitive load exploitation, anchoring, social norm pressure, these are not confined to coffee shops. They are the operating logic of every subscription renewal you did not consciously authorize, every pre-checked box you accepted, every default plan you are still on. Thaler and Sunstein's central argument in Nudge is not that choice architecture is inherently manipulative, it is that it is inherently unavoidable. Someone is always setting the default. The question is whether that person has your interests in mind or their own. Samuelson and Zeckhauser showed us in 1988 that the status quo is not a neutral position. Madrian and Shea showed us in 2001 that the same inertia that can trap you in a bad default can liberate you in a good one. The 401k data prove that defaults can be set in the interest of the chooser. The architecture is not the enemy. Unconscious compliance with it is. You now have the mechanism. You have 3 questions that collapse the default's power the moment you ask them. The commercial world is full of choices that were made for you before you arrived. If this changed how you think about defaults and deliberate choice, explore why you procrastinate. Your brain is doing this on purpose. Link is on screen now. And if you have not already, hit subscribe. We publish every Wednesday.